So let's talk a little bit about personal relationships. So much of what we've been talking about throughout the semester is how we interact with people we have relationships with. Friendships, family members, people we're in romantic relationships with. So we're really going to kind of narrow down today what is the difference in definition between a personal relationship and every other type of relationship you might have. So let's start by defining personal relationships. And it is defined as a voluntary commitment between irreplaceable individuals who are influenced by rules, relational dialectics, and surroundings. Now, just like a lot of the definitions we've done this semester, we can break this down into its pieces, which we will do, but the very first thing that I want to talk about, like most of the definitions, is the first word of it, that it is voluntary. That part is really important, and it basically means that you cannot be in a relationship, at least not a personal relationship with somebody, unless they are voluntarily in that relationship with you. For example, you can't date somebody if they are not dating you back. Or if any of you are old enough to remember the days of MySpace, one of the worst things in the world on MySpace was they used to have the top 8, or the top 16 or top 4, whatever you did, which basically meant that you had to list your favorite friends, your top friends on there. And that was like the most stressful thing in the world, because you would maybe list somebody as your number 1 or number 2, and then you'd go to their MySpace page and you were listed as like 6 or 7 on theirs. Clearly, they meant more to you than you meant to them. And although that's kind of a silly example, that is kind of how it works, that you have to voluntarily be involved or committed with that person. It has to be a two-way street. So let's break down the different pieces of this. This idea that it's a commitment, that it's irreplaceable individuals, that you deal with rules, relational dialectics, and surroundings. So we call these the features of the personal relationships. And this is basically a list of the same things we just talked about, but it's just phrasing it in a little bit easier way. That you have to have some element of uniqueness. So that is the idea that it is irreplaceable individuals. There has to be some level of commitment between the two people in the relationship. You have to follow some form of rules. You exist within surroundings or context, and you often will deal with something called, again, relational dialectics. Now, those of you who have taken Professor Harrigan's class, I believe it is Com Theory, will have dealt with relational dialectics as well, because it's a really big part of a lot of our communication. We're going to look at it here, but from a slightly different angle, so you might get a little bit different ideas and examples from it. So let's start with the first one of uniqueness. So the way to think about uniqueness is that there is a difference between what we call a social relationship and a personal relationship. Now, to start with, I want to stress a couple of things. One is that most of the relationships you have in your life will actually be social relationships. And it's also kind of complicated because you don't know what type of relationship it's going to be until you're in it and until it turns into a personal relationship. For example, when you first meet somebody, even, in the first couple of months of being in a relationship with them, whether you're dating them or whether it's a friendship, you don't know what your future is going to be until it actually happens. Think about in your life, I think about in my own life, people that I've met that I thought I would be really close friends with, and maybe we got along for a couple of months, maybe nothing even happened, but now years later, they're not really a part of my life. Yet a lot of the people who are important people in my life are ones I never really saw coming. They're ones who I didn't expect them to be such an important part of my life, because you just don't know if it's going to be a social relationship or a personal relationship until you're in it. This is that idea of uniqueness, though, that when it's a personal relationship, that person has some level of uniqueness to them. They are technically irreplaceable. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to have lots of different boyfriends and girlfriends in your life. It doesn't mean you won't have multiple best friends, but they're all slightly different from each other. They all hold a slightly different, this sounds cheesy, but a slightly different place in your heart. They mean something a little bit different to you. Where social relationships tend to be much more casual. It's much more of a, these are the people that you're just with. Sometimes I like to refer to these, as an example, as semester friends. And a semester friend, if you don't have an idea of what this is basically that person who you have a class with during the semester, and you get along super well because you see them all the time. You may hang out outside of school, but then the semester ends, you're not in any of their classes anymore, and a year or two goes by and you're like, I don't know what even happened to them. It's not that there was a falling out, nothing had to have happened, you just aren't really that good of friends anymore. Social relationships are the most common type of relationship we have, like a vast majority of the relationships we have in our lives are actually social relationships. But saying that, I want to make sure that I'm really clear about this, that I think that even though social relationships are much more common and they're not talked about nearly as often as personal relationships, they're still incredibly important. Just because that person isn't your person Just because they don't become your best friend or the person that you marry doesn't mean they didn't have a huge influence on your life, and it doesn't mean you didn't have a huge influence on theirs. People just don't generally write books or movies about social relationships. They tend to do it about personal relationships. We tend to idealize this idea of soulmates in our society when social relationships in a lot of ways can be just as important. So that's another thing I really want to stress, is that just because something is a social relationship doesn't mean it's not important. But for our definitions of communication, we're really going to focus more on that personal relationship when it goes to a higher level. One of the first things you need to have to tell the difference between it being a personal relationship and a social relationship is a level of commitment. You have to somehow be, again, voluntarily committed to that person. Now, there's actually 3 levels of commitment that exist. There's passion, commitment, and investment. Now, depending on the discipline that you're looking at, there are a couple of different ways that people will phrase this, but they're all very similar. Passion is the idea that it is that spark. It's that thing that makes you interested in that person. Now, when talking about passion, I think the wording can be a little confusing sometimes, because when you hear the word passion, people tend to think about it strictly as like a sexual nature, that it's a romantic relationship, and that is absolutely not necessarily the case. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Passion is simply the high. It's simply the thing that makes you interested, because you can be passionate about playing guitar or cooking or fixing cars or skydiving or ice skating, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a romantic thing. It's simply that emotional high you get, that excitement you get that makes you want more of something. Almost all relationships will start with some level of passion. And this is where, again, it can be complicated, because when you're in that phase, when you're feeling that passion towards a person, or that spark you get from that emotional high that makes you want to know them more, you often, while you're in that phase, automatically think that it's going to be a personal relationship, that this is going to be it, when often it's not necessarily. It's just the starting point. Where it will cross over from potentially being a social relationship to a personal relationship is when you have some level of commitment. Commitment, by definition, is the active decision to remain with that person after the high goes away, because passion is going to eventually fade. It doesn't mean that it can't come back again. But definitionally, you cannot exist on an emotional high all of the time, or else that becomes your new baseline. You have to come down from that high at some point, which basically means that you have to, at some point, see this other person as just a person. You're not necessarily excited by getting to know them anymore. You see them for their flaws. They see you for yours. They're just a person. And if you're still happy just sitting around with them, if you're still happy doing things that aren't exciting with them anymore, that's when you start to have that level of commitment where the excitement isn't there, but I still like you. I still want to spend time with you. That is when you establish your commitment. And then lastly, we have investment. And investment are the things you put into a relationship that you can't get back. So it tends to keep you in a relationship. That will be things like time and money. If you've been with this person for 10 years, that's definitely an investment, and you're likely to try to stay with them because of it, because you're not going to get those 10 years back. If you live together, it's going to be a lot harder to break up, or even if you're just friends, it's going to be a lot harder to separate, because now one of you has to find a new place to live. If you're married and you have children, that's a lot of investment that you have together, so it tends to keep you together. Think about if anybody has any friends from high school or middle school or whatever, so you don't really even have anything like to talk about, but you still consider them a friend because you just have so much history. That is literally an investment. Investments can be a very good thing because they can keep you holding on. They can keep you from, giving up on a relationship that you really should just be maybe putting more time and energy in. But it can also be a bad thing because investments can keep you in a relationship that you shouldn't be in. Because sometimes you will be with somebody who's bad for you, but you're like, I don't know anything else. This is the person I've been with for so long, and it just seems like a waste to throw that relationship away. So again, investment can be both good or bad depending on how you look at it. So relating to this, I'm actually going to link a video into the Blackboard discussion from a sexologist named Dr. Lindsay Doe, who I believe works out of Montana. And she is talking about something she calls love triangles, which basically defines which basically explains that there's different types of love you can feel. There's different connections you can have with people. And a lot of times our society tends to only focus on one type of that love or one or two types of love, or it looks at the whole picture instead of breaks it apart into its individual pieces. And I think it's really interesting the way that it goes along with this idea. In the love triangle, she actually breaks it down as passion, commitment, and intimacy. So it's very similar to what we're talking about here. But again, it kind of just looks at the different types of relationships that exist and how each one of them are important in their own. So that is going to be a link that I'm going to put over in Blackboard for you because I think it's really interesting. Regardless of what type of relationship you're in, you're going to follow some sort of rules. And we're actually not going to talk a whole lot about this right here because I'm going to send this over to the discussion board. But I want you to talk a little bit about what are some of the different types of rules that might exist within your relationship. One way to think about this is that different rules may exist for different relationships depending on the people within that relationship and what they value. So if we're talking about romantic rules, an automatic one might be something like you have to stay faithful to one person. But I'm going to just kind of flip this a little bit and tell you guys that, are you aware that 20% of married couples are actually in polyamorous relationships, which basically means that if we go back to, if you watch that video about the love triangles, that at least one of the people within that committed relationship are allowed to have relationships of some kind with other people outside of the marriage. 20% of married couples actually exist somehow within one of these polyamorous relationships. So this whole idea of staying committed to your significant other may exist for some people as a rule, but not others. So it really kind of depends on just what's happening within that relationship and what kind of rules you set for yourself. So again, we're not going to talk about this right here. We're going to send this over to the discussion board and see what you guys have to say over there. All relationships also take place in some sort of an environment, in a surroundings, or in a context. The way to think about it is that it's never just you and the other person, right? It's always you, the other person, and everybody else. And often it's the everybody else that starts to complicate things. Because think about in a relationship, is it important to you that your significant other, your best friend, whatever, gets along with your parents? Maybe it is. It probably is, especially if it's a romantic relationship, especially if it's a committed romantic relationship. But maybe it's not. Is it important to you that your, significant other gets along with your friends? Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. Maybe there comes a point where you don't care that they don't fit in with your friends because maybe you feel like you don't fit in with your friends anymore. Or maybe you think it's okay that different people have different interests. But that is part of that idea of your context. It's how does the outside world influence that relationship? This is also a way to think about it is how does that person or how does your relationship behave in different contexts? Do you feel like you guys are great in one situation, but anytime you go to another situation, you just can't? You just don't have anything in common anymore? This is a common thing that happens within relationships. When it's just the two of you at home, everything might be wonderful. But as soon as you go out and you involve other people, suddenly you're fighting. Suddenly you don't recognize that person anymore. Suddenly you're not behaving the way you normally would. But those are examples of context. And the important thing here is I want you just to think about it. To be aware in your own life and in your own relationships, how is the outside world influencing your relationship? It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to change it, but at least be aware. Be aware of how other people, of how other situations, or be aware of how all of this stuff influences the way your relationship is progressing. Relational dialectics is basically a fancy way of saying opposing issues that create tension. So a way to think about this is they're kind of like fundamental personality differences that you need to deal with. Now, dealing with a relational dialectic or having a fundamental difference between you and your partner doesn't necessarily mean it's going to end the relationship. But it does mean that it has to be dealt with at some point because it's something big enough that you can't ignore it forever. It's not going to be something tiny like you love Chinese food and they don't. That is not considered a relational dialectic. That's kind of a throwaway thing. These, again, are fundamental personality differences, fundamental differences in beliefs, fundamental differences on what you feel and how you believe you should live. So examples of that would be anything from autonomy versus connection is a really common one. An example would be something like, I am a very autonomous person. I like doing things by myself. I prefer not to be around a lot of other people. My spouse, on the other hand, is a highly connected person. She absolutely loves having lots of people around. So this whole quarantine is very, very strange on our relationship because she's having a lot harder of a time with it than I am. But it's that idea that it was causing fights for kind of a long time because she'd constantly be inviting other people over or wanting to have parties that I'm like, yeah, let's have a party. That's a great idea. But suddenly the invite list went from 10 people to 70. And you're like, how are 70 people even going to fit in our house? Where are all these people going to park? That's literally a difference of just fundamental beliefs and views and how we want to do things. I like to be alone. She likes to have people around her all the time. That is an example of a relational dialectic, is that somehow you have to deal with it. Openness versus closedness. If one person likes to talk about all of their issues and the other person doesn't, that could potentially cause some friction. Again, it doesn't mean the relationship won't work out, but it means you're somehow going to have to find a middle ground. Or even another one for me is novelty versus predictability. My best friend in school was a very, very spontaneous person. She always liked to just do things at the drop of a hat. I am not that kind of a person. I am a highly, highly, predictable person. I like to make lists. I like to, if we're going on vacation, if I'm traveling, I like to know exactly where I'm going and where I'm going to stop. It doesn't mean that I can't stray off of it a little bit, but I have to at least have a plan for what's happening. So going on trips with her was horrible because she hated how structured I was and I hated how loose she was with everything. That could, again, potentially can really damage a relationship if you don't deal with it. Other examples could be anything from you want kids and that person doesn't. Sure, that might be fine for right now, but eventually that's going to become an issue. Or you want to live in Buffalo and they are set on living in Texas, but you need to stay here. That's another relational dialectic. At some point, it's going to become an issue that you're going to have to deal with. So again, they're opposing issues that don't necessarily mean the relationship isn't going to work, but you absolutely have to deal with them at some point. Hopefully your relationship is going to last forever, but we all know that sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it will end somewhat abruptly if that person somehow violated your trust. Maybe they cheated, maybe they betrayed you in some way. Often it'll happen very slowly. But when it does happen, we will often go through what we call the relationship breakdown, which are steps that you will go through as your relationship slowly starts to dissolve. A lot of times you're halfway through the process before you even realize it started, and then you look back and you realize those steps have already happened. Another thing about the relationship breakdown process is once it starts, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go all the way. So for example, you might get to the dyadic process or the social support process, and then that's it. And then you're able to fix your relationship. Another thing about it is that there is no set amount of time which people will go through this. Sometimes it happens very quickly. Sometimes people will be stuck in one of these phases for years. It is absolutely a thing where people will be in the grave dressing process. They know the relationship is over, but they don't know what to do about it. They may be stuck in there for years. The general rule of thumb on this is that the shorter the relationship, the faster it takes to go through this, and the longer the relationship, the more serious the relationship, the longer it takes to go through this. So let's start by going through the first one, which is the intrapsychic process. This is the point in the relationship breakdown where you start to focus on the negatives of that person. So think about in early relationships, when you are first getting to know somebody, when you're first getting involved with somebody, your selective perception causes you to only see the good in them. You tend to completely disregard the bad. You don't notice it at all. The intrapsychic process is kind of like when that reverses and you start to see the bad. Little things about them that never used to annoy you suddenly do. You suddenly can't stand that they leave just a little bit of milk in the refrigerator. You can't stand that they leave their socks in the middle of the floor, or that they're always late, or that they never ask you how you're doing, whatever it is. What's interesting about the intrapsychic process is that it tends to be cyclical, meaning that once you start focusing on the bad, that's all you see, and then you start to notice more and more things that maybe don't even bother you, but it tends to just start to spiral that way. The dyadic process is whenever your normal routine starts to break down. Maybe it's a friendship and you make sure that you call each other every Thursday. Now you're not doing it so much. Instead of texting all the time, you're only texting a little bit. Instead of going on date nights, you're not doing that anymore. In, physical relationships, often like sex stops at this point. Whatever that routine is, you're not making time for that person anymore, and they tend to not be making time for you anymore either. Your social support process is a lot of times the phase where people will start to realize that this is happening. They maybe were clueless beforehand. And the social support process is exactly what it sounds like. You start getting opinions. You start getting support from the people around you. It could just be a friend that you're complaining to. It could be marriage counseling or actual therapy. Sometimes you don't even know that you're having a problem until maybe one of your friends says hey, you've been complaining a lot about this relationship lately. Are you sure you're really happy? And then suddenly you might realize that, all of these other steps have already happened. Once you're in the social support process, your friends, your family, your counselor, whoever it is, might tell you hey, things aren't that bad, you're really overreacting, or maybe you should try to make it work. Or they might say, if you don't want to be in this relationship, you shouldn't be in it anymore. There's no one way that this goes. The grave dressing process is exactly what it sounds like. It's a very morbid way to phrase this, but it's when you realize your relationship is over and you're trying to figure out how to end it. This is the point, as I said, a lot of times people can be in this for a very long time. You realize you're not interested in this person anymore. This can be especially complicated if it's a marriage, especially if it's a marriage that has lots of investments in it, but you just don't know what to do. You don't know how to get out of that relationship. Sometimes people will be stuck like this, in a relationship, in a friendship, in a marriage where they aren't interested in that person anymore, and they know that. They know that relationship's over, but it's just easier just to stay than to try to figure out what to do. And then lastly, we have the resurrection process, which is when you put your life back together again. Just like how quickly or slowly this process can take, the resurrection process, it just kind of depends. If it's a short-term thing, you might be over it in a day or two. You might be over it in a couple of weeks. If it was something that was long-term, if it was something that was maybe even short-term but really meaningful, it might take you a really long time to put your pieces back together. And maybe you never do. You may always have a soft spot, or you may always have like a scar because of what happened in that relationship. One thing I also just want to mention here briefly is I think our society is a little bit unfair when it comes to friendships versus romantic relationships, because we put so much value in romantic relationships that we tend to not celebrate platonic friendships. I would argue that platonic friendships are not only just as important as romantic relationships, but probably a lot more important. And even things like when the relationship ends, when you break up with a romantic partner, people get it. They get that you're upset and they let you kind of go through that process. But when it's a friendship, it's really hard to kind of explain why it hurts so bad. And that's all still part of that resurrection process. At any point, though, you might realize there's a problem and you might try to fix that relationship. And there's two basic processes that happen here: the intrapersonal repair, or you might use interpersonal repair. And basically the difference here is that intrapersonal tends to happen first because it's when you try to figure out the problems by yourself. You realize there's a problem, you're not going to involve the other person, you try to do it all on your end. I'm going to try to fix this relationship by not complaining so much, or to put more effort in, or to spend more time, or whatever it is. You try to say, if I put more effort on my side, they'll hopefully put more effort in on their side. And maybe that'll work. Maybe it's just you need to jumpstart that relationship. Interpersonal repair is when you involve the other person. You tell them there's a problem and we need to work on this together. Again, intrapersonal usually happens first. For most situations, you realize there's an issue and you say, okay, I'm going to see what I can do and see if I can fix this on my own. Going back to that video again about the different types of love and the different types of relationships we have, there are a number of different ways in which people can love. And as we go through this list, you'll probably know people who fall into each of these categories. You've probably experienced multiple ones of these yourself. And you can also see that there's some that are slightly more, I don't want to use the word healthy, but that's kind of what it is. There are definitely some that are a little bit more healthy than others. So the first we have is eros. And I should also mention that these are mostly Latin words. Eros is passionate love. This is like your summer fling. This is got started really fast and it tend to burn real fast as well. This tends to be based solely on passion. You meet somebody, you completely fall for them. Again, this can be a friendship as well. You fall fast, you fall hard, and then there is a tendency for it to go away very quickly as well. Storge is best friend love. The way to think about this is the kind where it's just truly your best friend. If it is a romantic relationship, it occurs usually as in like one day you just see the person in a different way. They'd always been your friend. You never thought of them as anything other than that. And then one day they become more. Or this truly is just the love you have for your best friend. It tends to happen very, very slowly because passion isn't usually an issue with this one so much as it's long-term commitments. Lotus is playful love. It's manipulative love. The easiest way to think about this one is it's the thrill of the chase. This is a don't hate the player, hate the game sort of situation where it's all about you want to see if you can get that person. What's a little complicated about Lotus, though, is sometimes it'll happen without you realize you're doing it, that you get so caught up in the passion that wanting to get that person that once you do, you realize you might not actually be compatible with them anymore. You realize you might not actually want them anymore because once you have them, it's not really exciting. That is Lotus. Mania is exactly what it sounds like. It's emotional extremes. It's all over the place. This is the kind of stuff you tend to see glamorized in a lot of high school movies, where it's extreme love, extreme hate, extreme love, extreme hate. And I'm going to go out on a limb on this one and say that this is a really dangerous type of love that Hollywood definitely likes to romanticize, whereas in a lot of these other styles of love are a little bit more boring, I guess we can say, although they tend to be a little bit more emotionally healthy. If anybody who's ever been in a mania-based relationship, you know that that's probably true, because things just run hot and cold all the time. It tends to be very back and forth. This, to go back to when we talked about self-concept, will often result in a very anxious attachment style. Agape is selfless love. This is literally parents for their kids, your dog for you. It's that idea where you love another person more than you love yourself. Just as a kind of a side story on this, when I was in 6th grade, I believe it was, our school did Project No. And if you don't know what Project No is, if you didn't do this, it's basically like sex ed for kids. And one of the questions that came up in this class was the instructor who came in asked if anybody could define what love was. How do you know you're in love? And I raised my hand and said that I think love is when you're willing to jump in front of a bus for the other person. And the whole class laughed at me, and it hurt my feelings really bad. But to this day, I still think that's what it is, because I guess I just believe in agape love. It's that very selfless, you love them so much more than you love yourself. And lastly, we have pragma. Pragma love is logical love. It's pragmatic love. It's love that just makes sense. So this could be anything from if you're a widower and you remarry, or you're now in a relationship with another widow, where maybe when you were younger, you wouldn't have gotten along so much, but now they're available. You enjoy spending time together. It's not perfect, but you focus on the positives. What's interesting about pragma and pragmatic love is that there have been a number of studies done looking at this type of love compared to other types long term. And people who practice pragma love often report higher, relational satisfaction later on down the road. And it's because they tend to focus again on the positives. The most common way that we will see pragma is actually in arranged marriages, where arranged marriages are still very common in a lot of parts of the world. And if it's the idea that you have to marry somebody, how it works is that you find the good in them. You focus on what you like about them, and you try to ignore the stuff that isn't working. So you spend a lot of time making that, relationship work because it's logical. It makes sense for that relationship to work. So looking at these, think about the different ones that you feel you've done. Think about the ones that you've seen other people have done, and really just recognize that although we tend to use the term love very generically, there's so many different ways that we can love people. There's so many different ways that we can express and feel that emotion. The last thing we're going to talk a little bit about is just 2 last relationship theories to kind of tie everything up. And both of these I think make sense, but I think it's worth mentioning. There's something called the social exchange theory that basically says that we have a tendency to develop relationships that we believe will be mutually beneficial. Or at the very least, we should say there's a tendency to try to maintain relationships that are mutually beneficial. It's hard to put everything into a relationship that you feel like you don't get anything out of. You need to feel like it's a two-way street, that person is going to be there for you just like you were there for them. Now, it doesn't necessarily explain what you're getting out of that relationship. You may be putting one thing in and getting something else out, but the idea is that there has to be some sort of give and take in a relationship. This is closely related to the equity theory, which makes perfect sense but tends to not happen in every relationship. And it says that we are happiest in a relationship where we feel we are equal. Or you can look at the reverse and say, if we feel we are unequal in a relationship, that can lead to a lot of dissatisfaction. Now, this equality can take place in any way from, shared decision making, sharing, tasks around the house, feeling like you are on equal footing to them, like they aren't, bossing you around all the time, that they respect your opinion, that there's some form of equality there. Now, this is one that can be complicated in terms of the different ways that people can feel unequal in relationships. For example, the number one cause of divorce in this country is money. And it's not just that we don't have enough money. That is absolutely part of it, because not having enough money can cause a lot of stress on relationships. But a part of it is also the inequality of money. If one person makes significantly more than another, that could be problematic in a relationship. It absolutely does not mean it has to be. But there are some cases where it has been, because one person may say, like, this is my money, this is your money, and people might start getting territorial over things. If one person is significantly older than another, that could cause an inequality problem. Again, it doesn't have to. I actually have a friend who married somebody who is 20 years older than her, and they've been married for like 30 years, so clearly it's worked out very well for them. But I've also known other people who have been in relationships who are a lot older or a lot younger, and that age gap has caused a lot of problems for them because one just felt unequal to the other. This can happen with education levels, the importance in your job, any number of reasons that a person might feel unequal. This even could be something as simple as, I hate that you always mow the lawn and I always have to take care of the kids, or whatever it is. There has to be some way that you find equality within your relationship in order for it to be the most successful. Now, we're actually going to analyze another movie related to these units, and there will be an assignment over in the assignment folder as well that gives specifics and some of the due dates and the information. I will email you guys the movie, or you can find it online in a number of different places. And we're going to be analyzing the movie This Is Where I Leave You. Came out just a couple of years ago, a lot of big name actors and actresses in it. And for this paper, I want you to analyze it very much the same way you did with the movie The Hate You Give, except this time I'm not going to tell you what to look for. Instead, I want you to identify any 3 terms or theories or ideas that we talked about throughout the semester that you think, played out in the movie, and give specific examples of how you think those theories exist in the film. Now, although you can talk about absolutely anything you want throughout the entire semester, I highly recommend that you really look at the idea of self-concept and this idea of personal relationships, because you could definitely write the entire paper just on theories from self-concept. That's why I kind of timed this assignment the way that I did. So keep an eye out for that, and then make sure you head over to the discussion board to talk about some of the different rules that exist within relationships as well.